He briefly and clearly informed the young gentleman that the result of the training was counted. Fan Xian immediately got to his feet in shock and said that he had never been able to defeat his uncle. He calmly replied that the young man was now strong enough, so their training was over. Fan Xian replied with a firm refusal. Wu Ju, though he didn't show it, was clearly surprised. Fan Xian's dark hair fluttered fantastically in the wind. The young man pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and put his hand on his chest. The face of this grown-up guy expressed the most real seriousness, covered in reddish abrasions and scratches. Fan Xian informed his uncle Wu Ju that he did not need any credit. The young man said that he would like to continue the fight. Wu Ju didn't even move an eyebrow at such a statement. A few seconds later, Fan Xian was stuck in the ground with his face and his ass to the top like an ostrich. Uncle Wu Ju briefly replied to the young man that he had done everything as the guy wanted. Fan Xian stayed in the ground and cursed loudly with bad words. In the evening closer to night, the seals on the roof gave each other a relaxing massage. A partially undressed Fan Xian was sitting on the bed in his chambers with a grown-up pink-haired maid named Leaves Isai. She, all rosy, was kneading the young man's shoulders. He sometimes zooed and awed as he had been beaten up by Mr. Wushu the day before. A drop of cold sweat was running down the girl's face. She was excited that her young master had such wounds on his body. She asked the young man if it was true that Mr. Wu Ju's blows were clearly not a joke. She was worried about it since the master was still so young. The beaten Fan Xian smiled sweetly while the girl gave him a massage. The young man told the pink-haired maid that he felt all this when he was still a child. However, after many years, when Fan Xian noticed the changes in his body, he finally understood some things. A young gentleman named Fan Xian began to beat his chest and quoted Uncle Wu Ju's words that squatting is laying the foundation and slicing carrots is training the mind. Beating Fan Xian was to train vision and reaction, and it was also a training of the fighting instinct. The girl stopped in fright. Fan Xian stretched out his hand and told Liu Zai that Uncle Wu Ju was beating him for his own good. Liu Zai covered her mouth with her hand in shock. She was thinking that apparently the young gentleman had been beaten off the last brains. The young man looked at his hand carefully and said that Uncle Wu Ju had told him that it was all nothing. The guy clenched his fist tightly, concentrating some Kai energy in it. He then said that Uncle Wu Shu had told him that the real danger was the Red Rope Knight. The girl looked at her master in surprise and asked about the real danger. Suddenly, the young man grabbed the girl, blushing with embarrassment, by the hand and put her on his lap, saying that she should forget it. Fan Xian decided not to talk about it, but to ask Liu Zai that is it possible for them to spoil such a good day with such stupid conversations. Liu Zai was all embarrassed, and calling the young gentleman asked him what he was talking about at all. The young man hovered over the girl, telling her that today he decided to tell her a story about ghosts, which was called Do You Have Legs? The next day, as usual, Fan Xian devoted the morning to his training. Sighing after another exercise, he heard the sound of hooves. The young man tensed and pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose. Were they horses? The young gentleman heard the hoofbeats of obviously several horses. He glanced at the gate of his house, thinking that it looked like a whole squad was approaching, and there were clearly not a few people in it. He ran to the gate and abruptly opened it. Fan Xian froze and even opened his mouth slightly when he saw the squad in front of him. They were knights in red robes. The guy's eyebrows moved to the bridge of his nose even more. The red-robed guards dismounted from their horses and knelt right in front of the young gentleman named Fan Xian. One of these red-robed guards reported that on Mr. Fan Xian's orders he had to return to the capital. The young man's eyes bulged in shock and asked again what returned to the capital. At this time, Grandma Fan was sitting in her chambers and cut out various figures from red paper. Being in shock, Fan Xian immediately ran to his grandmother with loud cries that there were some people in red clothes at the gate who came to take Fan Xian to the capital. She closed her eyes and calmly said that she had already given up on this idea, since in her opinion the capital was not the best place for the young master to live because Fan Xian's mother died there. His grandmother believed that his mother would have lived longer if she had stayed in Danju. After listening to the grandmother, Fan Xian pointed to the door and said that all these people in red clothes were kneeling as if insisting that the young master had to leave Danju for the capital, to which his grandmother told him that it was good that they were standing there. Then she added that let them stand like that until they die. From admiration, the young man's eyes lit up with a bright light, and stars appeared instead of pupils. Fan Xian thought that his grandmother was a really cool woman. Then the guy ran back, finally waving his hand and telling his grandmother that he understood everything. An elderly woman at this moment made an incision on the paper with scissors. Looking at the paper, she sighed because she had been distracted earlier. Branny Fan looked at the paper and realized that she had cut it off in the wrong place. Fan Xian swiftly sliced white carrots with 2 large cleavers. The young man did it very skillfully. The white carrots were cut very finely, evenly, and thinly while the young master was engaged in fine slicing this very white carrot. Wu Ju sat near the door and breathed fresh air. At one point when both men were silent, Fan Xian could not stand it and broke the silence. He turned to Uncle Wu Ju and said that the young master had been tormented by only one question lately. To which the man with a black blindfold immediately replied to the dark-haired guy that it was up to him to go or not to go to the capital. The young man, surprised at his uncle's insights, sat down next to him and asked him how he could find out what he wanted to ask. Wu Ju remained silent. Fan Xian had no choice but to overwhelm his uncle with a huge number of questions. He was asking why those red-robed guards were so eager to take the young master to the capital. Fan Xian on the one hand would like to leave and tell the capital, but on the other hand he was also a little apprehensive. Fan Xian then reminded Uncle Wu Shu that he had told him that his mother had died in the capital. The dark-haired guy was interested in the fact that the person who killed her was still in the capital or not anymore. Then the young man reminded Uncle Wu Shu that he had said that if Fan Xian ran into danger, then the young man did not have time to finish. Wu Ju replied to him with lightning speed that he would definitely go with the young master. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked Uncle Wu Ju again. He repeated again that he would go with Fan Xian to the capital. Then the young man sighed heavily. After a short silence, he turned back to Mr. Wu Ju and told him that there was something else Fan sighed and wanted to ask you about a long time ago. The latter asked him what he wanted to ask. The young master raised his eyebrows and made a thoughtful face, asking Uncle Wu Ju that when the young master turns 80 years old, will Uncle Wu Ju's face remain the same? He didn't make a sound again. Returning back to her room, the maid called Fan Xian to have lunch. He walked with Lu Zai to the table where another servant was waiting for him. The table was covered with various goodies: tofu, baked chicken, mushroom soup, seafood, and bamboo shoots. Sitting down at the table, the young man asked why his grandmother did not come to lunch. A servant in a turquoise outfit bowed slightly and said that the lady was keen on reading, so she asked her grandson named Fan Xian to have lunch alone. The young gentleman, armed with wooden chopsticks and a spoon, began to eat. He scooped up a spoonful of mushroom soup, then quite a bit of bamboo shoots, a piece of seafood, a very small piece of chicken. After chewing on this modest lunch, Fan Xian grabbed a plate with bamboo shoots in his hands and said that it was a very tasty dish that he liked. The guy abruptly got up from the table and said that he would finish these bamboo shoots in his room. The servant in the turquoise outfit opened his mouth in shock and froze. Then he clarified that Fan Xian would really take only one plate with him. He asked what he should do with the others, the young man quickly leaving with his pink-haired maid named Lu's eyes. I told them as usual to just eat everything. When the servant and the maid were left alone, he cursed and whispered contemptuously that even if this illegitimate child did not follow the rules, he still looked like a master. The blonde maid looked at the remaining dishes and said that according to custom, servants could only eat what their master left them. However, this young gentleman only tasted a piece of each dish. The maid thought it was too arrogant an act. The male servant arched an eyebrow and pouted, agreeing with the woman. He sincerely did not understand why the lady loved this young gentleman named Fan Xian so much. Then he invited the blonde maid to share the leftovers with all the other servants. She nodded. At this time, Fan Xian was walking very quickly into the room holding a plate with bamboo shoots in his hands. Liu Zai excitedly ran after him, asking her master what had happened. He reported with all seriousness and severity that he had been poisoned. A pink-haired maid named Liu Zai cried out in shock, surprised that someone dared to poison the young master. Cold sweat trickled down Fan Xian's face. He looked at the plate with green bamboo shoots and said that it was this dish that someone had poisoned. Fan Xian thought to himself that he always tasted the dishes before letting grandma and all the servants touched the food. The young man did this in order to avoid such a case where his grandmother and servants would be poisoned. The young gentleman named Fan Xian ran into the room, opened a drawer of a wooden chest of drawers, and took a paper bag from there. Opening it, Fan Xian poured the powder into his mouth and swallowed. And then the young man, just a couple of moments later, threw up on this wooden chest of drawers. Lu's eyes. I was terribly worried and stroked her master's back while he was sick. When he was done, Fan Xian wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his robes. A maid named Lu Zai's eye, already all red with excitement, crying loudly, told her master, choking with tears, that Fan Xian had to get better. Then the girl announced, crying even louder, that she would not survive if something happened to the young master. Just a second later, Fan Xian leveled up and grinned. Cold sweat was still running down his face. The girl looked at her master in shock. The maid named Lu Zai's eye didn't understand how he came to his senses so quickly. He immediately reported that there was not much poison in this dish, so everything is fine with him. To himself, the young man thought about this poison. This poison was called cat button. It was often used by spies from the Observer Council. Malkusi was a fruit from the southern islands, the juice of which did not manifest itself when mixed with other products. In addition, Malkusi was extremely difficult to detect. That is why spies were often used to commit murders that needed to be hidden. After this poison from the juice of the Malkusi fruit got into the stomach, it immediately began to act, causing convulsions and death in people. In addition, it was almost impossible to determine the causes of death in such cases. This poison itself from the juice of the Malkusi fruit had a faint taste. The only drawback of this poison was its slightly bitter tint. Fan Xian concluded that the killer must have known about it, so he mixed this poison with bamboo shoots. Apparently, this killer was clearly well versed in various poisons. However, the young gentleman was confused by the fact that the dose of this poison from the juice of the Malkusi fruit was clearly not fatal. The only thing that could be is simple diarrhea. Who could have done this? Fan Xian looked at his maid named Lu Zai and asked her if she knew by chance where they got these bamboo shoots from. The girl scratched her chin thoughtfully and reported that Lao, his nephew, had brought these bamboo shoots to their kitchen this morning. Fan Xian frowned thoughtfully, asking the pink-haired Lu Zai's eye, that wasn't it usually Lao Ha himself who did this? The young gentleman was interested in why his nephew suddenly replaced him today. Lu Zai naively looked at her master and reported that the other servants said that Lao Ha was ill, so his nephew was doing the delivery today. Then she asked Fan Xian if something was wrong. Fan Xian scratched his chin thoughtfully. Frowning, he began to analyze the information he had heard earlier. The young man was confused by the fact that Today's deliverer of bamboo shoots was called Lao Ha's nephew. As far as Fan Xian knew, Lao Ha was lonely. Where did his nephew come from? Fan Xian concluded that this nephew was supposed to be the real killer. Poisoned but not killed, the young man did not know what this killer was up to. What kind of games did he play? Coming out of his thoughts, Fan Xian quickly walked outside. An excited maid named Liu Zai's eye ran after him, asking about where the guy was going. Then she asked her master if he was feeling better and then offered to call a doctor. Fan Xian stopped and turned to the pink-haired girl, lightly hugging her. He convinced her that everything was fine with him, so he would leave for a while. The girl resolutely stated that in that case Cease would go with him. The guy turned around and walked briskly again. Throwing has made a final word that it could be dangerous there, which is why the lovely maid Lu's eyes I should have stayed at home. Fan Xian walked resolutely towards Lao Ha's house. He was thinking that since the young man himself could not figure it out, he decided to just go and ask Lao Ha about it personally. Fan Xian really wanted to see who the killer was. The young gentleman wanted to know why he was doing this. Fan Xian ran very fast to Lao Ha's house. Practice quickly approaching this house, the young man froze, scouting the situation with his weapon in his hands. Seeing the bound Mr. Lao Hall, the guy frowned. He was thinking that apparently the killer wanted to get rid of this man named Lao Ha. The young man decided that to begin with he should have saved the man, and then asked about everything. A young gentleman named Fan Xian was walking quickly to meet Lao Ha along the way, telling him that he had come to save the man. Having almost untied and removed the cloth gag from the man's mouth, Fan Xian sternly asked him about who could have done this to this man. He started coughing and then shouted, warning the young master about something behind him. Sensing movement behind him, the young gentleman named Fan Xian froze for a second, narrowing his eyes. Behind him, a man in dark clothes and a blue pattern tattoo practically attacked Fan Xian with his blade. A young man took his sword out of its scabbard with lightning speed and blocked the man's attack so that even the energy concentrated in the sword collapsed into a small fiery explosion upon impact. The assassin bulged his eyes and tried to attack Fan Xian again. However, he bit his lip hard and also repelled the attack with lightning speed. The man with the blade flew to the side. At this time, Lao Ha finally freed himself from the ropes. Fan Xian lowered his sword and sternly looked at the mercenary with the blade, asking him if he was responsible for poisoning the bamboo shoots prepared for the young master. A dark-haired man with a scar on his nose named Ting Zijing stopped and grunted when he heard Fan Xian's question. However, he then attacked the youth again. A white-haired man named Lao Ha shouted, raised his hands up when Tang Zijing began to approach them. The elderly man was really very scared. When Tang Zijing almost attacked the dark-haired youth, he put his hand forward and forced him to stop. He immediately stopped and waited in silence. Meanwhile, after making sure that the scarred man had stopped, the young master took Lao Ha aside and told him to stand further away. He obediently walked away. Shikling Fan Xian smiled and then swung his sharp metal sword, telling Tang Zijing that now the young man could teach this man with the scar on his nose a good lesson. He grunted again and took out a bunch of small throwing knives, attacking the young man. He gritted his teeth and said through them that Fan Xian was too soft and sentimental. Then he accurately threw a bunch of these knives in the direction of the young man. The throwing knives were filled with Zijing's purple energy, which even sparkled at their tips. However, even though the attack was a mark, Fan Xian was able to block this attack with ease, fighting off a pile of knives with his sword alone. The dark-haired young master quickly ran towards Tang Zijing and attacked him with his sword filled with his bright blue inner Kai energy. The man named Tang Zijing rolled head over heels to the side again, attacking the young gentleman named Fan Xian with a bunch of his throwing blades. They, filled with bright purple energy, flew aptly towards Fan Xian again. The young man miraculously managed to dodge them, not understanding where this man got so many of these knives. Tang Zijing took out another portion of these sharp knives again, and very quickly directed them towards the young man. Fan Xian, terrified, sweating all over, looked at Zijing and asked him that was it really not the end. The guy wondered if this Tang Zijing was even a person. Fan Xian had no other choice. He jumped and galloped around Laoga's courtyard, dodging fast blades. First he jumped on wooden boxes, and then he ran along the wooden wall of Laoga's house, and then he dodged those sharp knives again. Fan Xian and Tang Zijing fought fiercely, not yielding to each other. This was observed by a blind man named Wu Ju, whom Fan Xian called uncle. He did not get into the fight at all, but only watched, sitting on the roof of a wooden building. Tang Zijing fought with his sharp blade with fans in, splashing his bright purple Kai energy. However, Fan Xian was also not inferior to him, attacking the man with the scar on his nose with his sharp sword, splashing his bright blue Kai energy. So they could fight until they were completely exhausted. However, Fan Xian was very cunning. He jumped over Tang Zijing and ended up behind him. This allowed the man with the scar on his nose to hesitate for a second. He turned and attacked the young man with his bright purple-tipped blade with lightning speed. Fan Xian was also not amiss and immediately attacked with lightning speed in response. They grappled with their sharp metal weapons, splashing each other's bright Kai energies. Then the men parted and then completely sat down on the ground. Tang Zijing wounded the young master in the shoulder. The guy holding onto his shoulder asked the dark-haired mercenary that did he put poison on his sharp dagger. Drops of cold sweat dripped down the serious guy's face, and the clothes on his shoulder began to gradually turn scarlet. Tang Zijing gripped his dagger tightly in his hands, briefly replying to the young master that he had lost. Then the man with the scar on his nose leveled off and began to slowly approach the guy, telling him that Tang Zijing did not expect that at such a young age Fan Xian possessed such strength. When he said he was sorry, the guy missed the kick. Fan Xian continued to sit on the ground with his back to him, holding on to his injured arm. Then Tang Zijing said that the poison in the food should make people unable to move, but the poison applied on the dagger should have killed the guy. Fan Xian frowned and turned around slightly, telling the man with the scar on his nose that he would keep this in mind. Tang Zijing looked closely at Fan Xian and said that the murderers were all cruel because that was the way it was. Fan Xian leaned forward slightly and exhaled, trying to stifle a chuckle. The latter looked at him in surprise and asked why Fan Xian was laughing. A young gentleman named Fan Xian turned to a dark-haired mercenary and asked that hadn't this guy ever heard that villains die from talking too much. Tang Zijing opened his eyes in shock and opened his mouth slightly, asking the young man again. Then he began to back away. The dagger fell out of the hands of this man with a scar on his nose. His legs stopped holding him, and Tang Zijing collapsed to the ground. Trembling, he was terrified and trembling all over, asking the young dark-haired gentleman about whether his sword was also poisoned. At this time, Fan Xian leveled up and, unable to restrain a grin, began to shake off his clothes, while Tang Xiang realized that he too was under the influence of poison. Then the youth named Fan Xian turned around, smiling eerily. He informed Tang Zijing that this young gentleman had been stuffed with various poisons since childhood, so it was impossible to take him with such a simple poison. Fan Xian placed his sword on Tang Zijing's shoulder with lightning speed. He shuddered in horror. The young gentleman looked down at the dark-haired mercenary. His gaze was filled with severity and seriousness. Fan Xian then told Tang Zijing to talk about what his goal was. Fan Xian, holding his sharp, moreover poisoned sword on Tang Zijing's shoulder, continued to question him about the purpose of these actions. The young man was interested in why this man with a scar on his nose poisoned his food. Besides, if Tang Zijing really poisoned her, then why did he use a non-lethal dose? Tang Zijing, breathing heavily through a confused breath, informed the young man that he only wanted to kill him. Besides, Tang Zijing did not want to involve the others in this matter. Fan Xian, without taking his stern gaze off the dark-haired hired killer, asked him about whether such mercy was characteristic of murderers. The guy was also interested in who sent Tang Zijing to kill him. The man with the scar on his nose straightened up and firmly replied that it was a secret order of the inspection, namely the murder of a traitor. Fan Xian couldn't contain his shock and cried out, surprised that he was considered a traitor. Tang Zijing shouted, and firmly standing on his own, said that even if he died, someone else would replace him in any case. He also said that no one, even if they wanted to, would be able to save the person the inspection was hunting. Fan Xian might still be breathing, but in the eyes of these inspection guys, he was already dead a long time ago. Fan Xian put his sword aside and quickly took out the golden badge that teacher Fei Jai had given him as a child. Seeing the badge, Tang Zijing opened his mouth in shock. Fan Xian, continuing to stare sternly at the man with the scar on his nose, said that Fei Jai from the 3rd Department of the Inspection Institute was his teacher. Tang Zijing found it harder to strain his composure from shock. He, bypassing the norms of decency, immediately asked the dark-haired guy that Fei Yo really was his teacher. Fan Xian, continuing to hold this polished gold badge, told Tang Zijing that the young gentleman was 16 years old at the moment, and in childhood he lost his mother. In addition, since Fan Xian was an illegitimate child, the young gentleman had never seen his father, and the dark-haired guy had lived here in Anju all his life. Fan Xian bent down and looked into Tang Zijing's eyes, asking him that with his life experience, the young man would have time to earn the status of a traitor. The latter, moving away from the shock for some time and digesting the information received, was silent, his mouth slightly open. Then the man with the scar on his nose said that everything Fan Xian had said earlier made sense. He looked seriously at the hired killer again and asked about what had happened to him and the guys from the inspection. Tang Zijing was silent again for a while, then moving away from his deep thoughts, he said that he had understood everything. As it seemed to him, someone gave a false order to eliminate Fan Xian. The young master suddenly dropped his sword and abruptly walked to the side. Sweat trickled down the face of the man with the scar on his nose. He tensed up and asked Fan Xian if he would really not kill him. To which the serious guy said that they had a big misunderstanding, so why would Fan Xian kill him? Tang Zijing suddenly announced loudly that since someone wanted to remove the young gentleman, and Tang Zijing's attempt failed, then most likely other hired assassins will appear who will try to silence this man with a scar on his nose. To which Fan Xian closed his eyes and calmly replied that it had absolutely nothing to do with the young master in any way. Then Fan Xian suddenly stopped and said that he had another question for Tang Zijing. The guy explained that their rules were very strict. The question was how Tang Zijing could pass for Lao He's nephew by appearing on Fan Xian's doorstep just once. Fan Xian turned around and looked at the assassin with a creepy look, asking him about who helped this man with a scar on his nose with documents. Tang Zijing was covered in cold sweat, feeling Fan Xian's creepy gaze on him. He, not even daring to look the young gentleman in the eye, stammered that their farm manager had helped him with the documents. After a while, the manager of the household, tied with a rope, sobbed, trying to justify himself by saying that if he had not helped Tang Zijing with the documents, they would have killed everyone else. And not as promised, only Fan Xian. He choked with tears, justifying himself by saying that he really did not want the others to suffer. Then he bowed and told the lady that he had done all this for their family. An elderly woman meanwhile silently listened, holding a white clay bowl with a lid in her hands to the excuses of the farm manager. Then she opened her blue eyes and began to drill into the man with a creepy look, telling him that since it was for the sake of the family, she was ready to listen. Then the manager of the household loudly announced that he had been sent by the second mistress to look after Fan Xian. The manager believed that if this guy went to the capital, he would definitely start litigation over the family-only property. The manager began to shed tears again, saying that in order to avoid this, it would be easier for the young gentleman to forbid him to appear in the capital for the rest of his days. Banging the bowl on the table, Grandma Fan stood up, holding onto a wooden stick, and said that it was all very logical. Besides, for the sake of the stability of the Fan family, soft-heartedness had to be discarded. Fan Xian, meanwhile, was slightly surprised, listening attentively to his grandmother, and froze. After a few seconds, he realized what his grandmother had said and went cold with shock. The guy was extremely surprised that his grandmother agreed with the words of the farm manager. Then the elderly woman turned around and sternly, even coldly, looked at her grandson, telling him that Xian should remember that with age it was necessary to learn to be ruthless. After these words, the elderly woman ordered the other servants to come to her chambers. 2 men immediately entered the elderly lady's room. Fan Xian shuddered excitedly, asking his grandmother about what she was up to. The manager of the household meanwhile stopped sobbing and pouring bitter tears. He even smiled and grinned, telling his mistress about how wise she was. However, suddenly Granny Fan touched the manager's shoulder with a wooden stick. He froze in surprise. The elderly woman looked coldly at the manager of the household and ordered the other servants to break his legs and put him in a boat, and moreover so that the manager could not set foot on land until his last breath. The manager made a sound of surprise. The servants grabbed the manager and carried him out of the room. He screamed and struggled. He shouted the word no and constantly called the mistress. However, she was clearly adamant. Already at the door, the manager of the household shouted to the mistress in the back that didn't she say that she couldn't stand this kid named Fan Xian? Was it all a lie? Listening to this, the young gentleman stood quietly and was silent. After some time, the lady broke the silence and asked her grandson about what Fan Xian himself was thinking. He, without expressing emotions at all, said in a calm voice that after all, another lady sent him gifts during the holidays. The young gentleman was so pleased to receive such tokens of attention. The elderly woman said that even with all this, they did not know whether the words of the farm manager were true. Then she said that she would write to Fan Xian's father and ask for an inspection. The young gentleman straightened up and called his grandmother in a serious tone, telling her that it was not worth doing this since he decided to find out everything on his own. She, in shock, opened her eyes wide and asked the young man about whether he really decided to go to the capital. Then she asked about the fact that hadn't the two of them agreed that Fan Xian would stay here in Danzhou. The young gentleman blushed slightly and smiled warmly, telling his grandmother that as she herself saw perfectly well, the young man had grown up, but he had not really seen anything in the world. Then he pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and looked away, saying that since there was the first killer, there will be a second one. Instead of hiding, Fan Xian could have gone there himself. Grandma Fan asked if her Grand Hansen had made a decision. For sure, he agreed, and then said that he would definitely return back to Danzhou when everything was fine. The elderly woman sighed heavily and said that in any case there were problems that needed to be solved. Then she asked when the young master decided to go to the capital. He lowered his gaze, announcing that he would go to the capital tomorrow. The elderly lady turned away and said that she would not come out tomorrow to see off her grandson as she was getting old and did not like to say goodbye. Fan Xian looked at her with a sad look and was silent. On the same day in the bamboo forest near the lake, Fan Xian sat on the shore and watched the bamboo leaves fall on the water surface. Tang Zijing stood next to him with his hands folded in front of him. Then the man with the scar on his nose broke their silence and asked Fan Xian if he could ask the young man for a favor. The young gentleman glanced at him briefly and asked what kind of service he had asked of him. Tang Zijing looked away with his cold gaze and asked Fan Xian to kill him. Fan Xian, hearing this strange request for a favor, raised his dark eyebrows and asked Tang Zijing again what kill him. The man with the scar on his nose silently looked into the distance and waited. After a few moments during which Fan Xian was absorbed in his thoughts, he finally spoke up, already asking Tang Zijing that he, as the young man assumed, meant to help an assassin hide his identity. Fan Xian then asked Tang Zijing that he apparently wanted to hide his identity due to the fact that the mercenary with the scar on his nose had to betray his employer earlier. Tang Zijing lowered his gaze and said that he had not betrayed anyone, but he had an important matter that Tang Zijing needed to attend to. Fan Xian pointed his thumb at himself and asked him what he would get from this service. Is the offer profitable? Tang Zijing giggled and then looked at Fan Xian with a creepy expression, asking the young master about what wouldn't he like to know about what tricks the second lady used to mislead the whole inspection institute. Fan Xian looked at Tang Zijing as if he was insane, and then told him to speak normally. He was embarrassed, and then said that Tang Zijing meant that in this way the investigation of Fan Xian would go much faster. Fan Xian thought about it, and scratched his chin, looking away. After little thought, he said that this clearly made sense. Then the guy smiled, and said that in that case he hoped for their fruitful cooperation. After a certain period of time, Fan Xian came to, as it turned out, the grocery store of the blind Uncle Wuju. A man with a black blindfold was tying small piles of firewood with a rope. Fan Xian sat down next to him and leaned his head on his arm. After a short silence, listening to the sounds of ropes and the friction of brushwood, the young man informed his Uncle Wuju that he had decided to go to the capital. The latter, not at all distracted from his important business with bundles of brushwood, briefly agreed with the young man's decision. Fan Xian was sitting sad and even kind of tired. A lingering and unpleasant longing spread through his body. Then the dark-haired young gentleman told his Uncle Wushu that he had been looking after this disobedient boy all these years. The young man was interested in the fact that didn't Uncle Wuzu have things that he would like to do, people that you cared about, or maybe some plans for the rest of his life? Hearing the boy's words, Wuju immediately asked if Fan Xian didn't need him anymore. The young master cried out in shock and horror. Then he began to tremble and worry terribly, saying that he always needed Uncle Wushu. Besides, in Fan Xian's opinion, the young man had no one more important and more expensive than Uncle Wushu. Agnelin asked about what the young man meant by this. At this time, Wuju picked up a broom and was ready to start sweeping his shop. Fan Xian lowered his gaze and told Uncle Wushu that he would go to the capital tomorrow. In addition to all this, he will go to the man who so desired the young man's death. Also, the young gentleman decided to try to find out what happened to his mother. Fan Xian thought it was a great option because he would do what he always wanted to do. Fan Xian then turned his stern gaze to Wuju's blind uncle, telling him that Wuju had said last time that he would follow Fan Xian to the capital and protect him. However, the dark-haired young man really hoped that Uncle would finally do what he liked. The young master really wanted his uncle, named Wuju, to finally start living for himself. The man with the black blindfold pressed his lips together and said nothing. At this time, Fan Xian was already at the door. He waved to Tom and said he was going. Then the guy slammed the door loudly, leaving Uncle Wushu alone with his thoughts. He sat in silence for a while, thinking. A man with a black blindfold was shaking his head to the sides, quoting Fan Xian's words, "Do what you like, live for yourself." Fan Xian returned to his quarters after a while and began to pack his things. He carefully folded his clothes and packed them in brown suitcases. Folding another set of clothes, Fan Xian felt quiet footsteps behind him. Then he froze and turned around. Slightly behind the young man stood Uncle Wuju with a black suitcase in his hands. He firmly informed the guy that he had found what he wanted to do. Fan Xian, unable to contain his shock, asked his uncle about how he was able to think about everything so quickly. Then blind Wuju took out a black suitcase and put it on the table. All this time while he was taking it out, carrying it, and putting it on the table, the dark-haired young gentleman was looking at this suitcase with interest. In the end, Fan Xian put his hands on the black suitcase and did not take his eyes off it. Wuju meanwhile said that this black suitcase was left to him by the mistress, that is Fan Xian's mother, and Uncle Wuju would like to finally open it. Then Wuju's uncle lowered his gaze slightly and reported that Fan Xian had told him the same thing that Fan Xian's mother had once told Wushu. A man with a black blindfold said that Fan Xian's mother really wanted Wushu to find something he would really like to do. Listening to the words of the blind Uncle Wuju, the young gentleman examined the black suitcase. Raising his eyebrows, the young man asked how they could open this suitcase. Uncle Wuju calmly reported that in order to open this suitcase they needed a key to it. Fan Xian turned around and held out his hand for Uncle Wuju to give him the key. However, he shrugged his shoulders and said that he did not have a key. Then Fan Xian knitted his eyebrow to the bridge of his nose and suggested that Uncle Wuju just open this black suitcase, imitating the suitcase and the sword with his hands. Mr. Wuju immediately drew his sword from its scabbard and concentrated his inner bright blue kai energy into it. He quickly pointed it at the black suitcase and tried to cut it. Fan Xian, not expecting this, stepped aside terrified. Wuju landed several blows on the black suitcase. A few seconds passed. The suitcase was still intact. However, literally a couple of seconds later, the table on which this suitcase was lying collapsed, collapsing into small pieces. But the suitcase that Fan Xian's mother left to Ju wasn't harmed. The young gentleman covered his ears because of the roar. He started shouting, asking Ju what this black suitcase was made of in the first place. Besides, where did his mom get this suitcase from? Wuju did not know the answer to these questions, which Fan Xian also reported. Then the young man looked at the man with a black blindfold and asked where in that case was the key. He reported that the key was in the capital, so Wuju decided to go with Fan Xian. The young gentleman chuckled happily and said that in that case they would be leaving for the capital tomorrow. Wuju began to leave the young man's chambers, finally telling him that he would go to the capital first and meet Fan Xian there. Then Xian asked about what he should do with this suitcase, to which Wuju told him to just leave him lying on the floor. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows looking at this black box. He was tormented by a number of questions. What was this box made of, and what kind of things needed such protection? The next day, red robe guards sat on horses near Fan Xian's house. They were holding big red flags in their hands, waiting for Fan Xian. The young man was heading towards them, holding the same black suitcase in his hands to take him to the capital. He was followed by a maid named Lu Zisai who wanted to escort her young master. Suddenly the young man stopped and cast a glance to the side. Granny Fan was standing in the middle of a room and looking at her sadly. She was thinking about Fan Xian. In her opinion, this child had become quite an adult and now had to leave. She was right. However, these thoughts greatly saddened the elderly lady. Suddenly Fan Xian appeared on the threshold of the room. He called his grandmother and she started in surprise. Then she turned around and said that she would not accompany her grandson as promised. However, the latter, not listening to his grandmother at all, went up to her and kissed her on the forehead. The elderly woman was stunned and stammering asked about what this child was doing at all. Fan Xian smiled and told Grandma to be sure to take care of herself. Besides, the young master promised to come back to pick up his grandmother when he had settled everything. Fan Xian then moved back and sat on his knees. After that, he bowed to the floor to his grandmother. She was smiling warmly on the smiling face of an elderly woman. Tears welled up in her eyes. Fan Xian went out into the courtyard. Guards in red robes holding red flags in their hands sat on horses and waited for the young master walking to his wooden carriage with a black box in his hands. The young gentleman ordered the guards to go to the capital. Stopping by the wooden carriage, Fan Xian confidently looked up into the gentle blue sky with almost no clouds and turned to the capital, telling her that he was already on his way. The wooden carriage began to move. Knights in red robes holding red flags in their hands rode horses in front. When the carriage started to leave, Lu's eyes, all in tears, shouted loudly to Master Fan Xian, telling him that he had to take care of himself while his maidservant was not around. Fan Xian looked out of the carriage window and, smiling warmly, waved to that pink-haired girl with his hand. Tang Zijing rolled his eyes slightly and wearily asked the young man about why he should not take his little maid with him. Finally tearing himself away from the window, Fan Xian leaned against the wooden wall of the carriage and told Tang Zijing that the guy did not know anything about the capital at all, so he would not want to expose the pink-haired maid named Lu Zisai to danger at all. Fan Xian fell silent after these words and thought about when the time would come. The black suitcase meanwhile was lying under Xian's seat and waiting in the wings. Towards evening, Fan Xian and all the servants with him decided to make a halt. Then he ordered a fire to be kindled on the bonfire as soon as possible. Xian and his servants were busy setting up the camp, while the guards in red robes meanwhile sat beside their horses on the grass and rested. After some time, dinner was prepared. Fan Xian handed a deep bowl to Tang Zijing, who only looked at him strangely. A young gentleman frowned and asked Tang Zijing with displeasure about why he stuck to him. Then the guy reminded the man with the scar on his nose that he was now Fan Xian's servant, and then told him to deliver food. A few moments later, Fan Xian was already sipping soup from his bowl and enjoying the picturesque view of the forest thicket. The guy was sitting on a log and sighing with pleasure. Next to him stood a thoughtful Tang Zijing, who periodically grunted. Fan Xian decided to start a conversation first and asked the former assassin if he knew why Fan Xian suddenly needed his father in the capital. He said that he thought it was quite obvious, since the young man had to prepare for his future role. Fan Xian reminded Tang Zijing that it was just the two of them here. Then he asked why he was hiding something from him. The man with the scar on his nose chuckled and said that the young gentleman was quite a joker. Young master Fan made a terrible expression on his face and told Tang Zijing that he sometimes had no time for jokes at all. The man with the scar on his nose shuddered and feared a drop of cold sweat trickled down his face. Fan Xian's expression became peaceful again. The frightened Tang Zijing walked a little forward and cleared his throat, telling the young man that as far as he knew, Fan Xian was being prepared for the wedding. The young master asked his servant again. Without expressing any emotions at all, he turned around slightly and said that Fan Xian, if he wanted, could believe or could not believe. However, the 4th Department of the Prosecutor's Office was responsible for espionage and inspections, and the 6th Department of the Prosecutor's Office was responsible for murders. In addition, Tang's was in both departments at once, so he believed that there could be no mistake in his words. Then he said that the prosecutor's office has always acted quickly and decisively. Also, this man noticed that if the people from the 6th Department decided to do something, then Fan Xian will no longer be a tenant. After these words, Tang Zijing imitated the demolition of the head with his hand. Fan Xian, listening to Zijing, thought that even if the killer was someone from the 6th Division, Uncle Wu Ju would solve this tricky question in A matter of seconds, then Fan Xian, holding a plate of food in his hands, asked Tang Zijing about whether he knew who would be the bride of the young master. He looked seriously at his master with his green eyes and said that Fan Xian's fiancée would be the daughter of the prime minister of the current dynasty. Fan Xian opened his mouth in shock and jerked, pouring food from the bowl. The young man was surprised that they wanted to marry him, illegitimate too. The daughter of the prime minister. The guy abruptly stood up and thought, scratching his chin, something was clearly wrong here. Tang Zijin, closing his eyes, said that Miss Lin's family was extremely virtuous, and her family had a really good reputation in the capital. However, that girl had very poor health. In addition, she had recently become seriously ill, so her family was in a hurry. Fan Xian slammed his fist into his palm, crying out from the realization of what was happening. So that was it. So it turns out Fan Xian something like a lucky charm for the line family. Blushing from shock, Tang Zijing pointed his finger at the guy, telling him that the young gentleman, by the way, was going to marry a girl who was about to die. The man with the scar on his nose wondered why the young man's reaction was not angry at all. He spread his arms to the sides and shrugged, closing his eyes. Then he said that there was no use in being angry. On the contrary, Fan Xian sympathized with her, since Miss Lin was forced to marry a man she had never met because of poor health. Tang Zijing folded his hands in front of him and fell silent. The young man asked him in surprise what had happened. The man grinned and said that nothing had happened. It just seemed to him that Fan Xian was different. Suddenly, Fan Xian stuck out his index finger and said that firstly, his departure to the capital did not mean that he would accept this marriage at all. Then he stuck out his second finger and said that secondly, if he agreed to the marriage, then the second party should please the young master. Then he put out a third finger, saying that thirdly, even if this girl was bad-written, the guy didn't see anything wrong with it. Fan Xian frowned and grinned, exposing the fourth finger on his hand. Then he said that fourthly, Tang Zijing probably did not know, but the young gentleman was not only well-versed in all kinds of poisons, but was also an excellent healer. Tang Zijing went to the carriage, finally telling Fan Xian to try. The man with the scar on his nose was wondering how the young master would cope with the disease, which was beyond the power of even imperial doctors. Fan Xian pouted his lips in displeasure and asked Tang Zijing about why he spoke like that. Did he not know at all how a servant was supposed to behave? After finishing the conversation with Tang Zijing, the young man grinned again and thought, scratching his chin, he thought that in any case they would live and see everything. Also, the young man was very interested. Miss Lin was pretty, or maybe Miss Lin is cute, or maybe this Miss Lin was a lowly. Such pleasant thoughts clearly warmed Fan Xian's soul. 2 months later, they arrived at the stone gates of the capital. An elderly coachman informed a young master named Fan Xian that they had almost arrived at the capital. Fan Xian looked out of the window and opened his mouth in shock, even exclaimed the capital was gorgeous, so big, beautiful, with burning lanterns and a bunch of people. Even in the evening, the street was very busy. The young man, as if spellbound, looked at the street through the window. Tang Zijing looked at the young master strangely and asked what happened. The latter, without taking his eyes off the window, said that this place was completely different from what Fan Xian thought he would see here. Tang Zijing chuckled and said that the capital was really different from Danju. Fan Xian continued to stare out the window in fascination. The bright light of Chinese paper lanterns was reflected in his brown eyes. The young man was smiling. This world seemed quite interesting to him. Meanwhile, a mercenary in dark robes sat bowing to the second lady. He was reporting with his head tilted down that the mission to kill Fan Xian had failed. Besides, the young master was on his way to the capital. The woman was silent for a while, then she said it was good to. A bloody dagger lay at her feet. She grinned and said that all this was gaining interesting momentum. Fan Xian stood surprised and with his mouth slightly open. He looked at the Fan family mansion and marveled at how incredible it was going inside. Fan Xian was met by a dark-haired maid with an interesting hairstyle. After bowing, she informed that the owner, Fan Xian's father, was not in the mansion at the moment. In addition, before leaving the mansion, the man ordered to give a warm welcome to the young gentleman. She also said that if Fan Xian needed anything, he could always turn to this maid. The guy smiled and nodded, thinking that it was very unexpected that his father, whom Xian had never met, was so interested in the young man. After some time, Fan Xian followed the maid along the stone road, around which there were clean and beautiful ponds. The young gentleman could not get enough of such beauty. He thought about having such a large residence in the capital where there was a war for every inch of land. It seemed to the young man that his father really was an extraordinary man. After a while, Fan Xian was already in the corridor of the mansion. An excited servant passed by him. This clearly alerted the young man, but he tried not to attach importance to it. Then the same situation happened with the other two mates. This time, Fan Xian turned around, thinking that the people who met him here on the way deliberately avoided the young man because of his status as illegitimate. Fan Xian clearly didn't care. He was thinking that shouldn't the father have been ashamed that he had an illegitimate child? When the dark-haired maid escorted the young master to his chambers, she stopped and bowed again, saying that the second lady had asked the young master to come to her when he was selling his chambers. He nodded and, smiling, replied, "Good." The maid standing in his chambers said that they were waiting for him very much. Then the young man put a black suitcase on the floor and sat down on a chair. After washing and wiping his face with a towel, he put it back in the basin that the maid was holding. Her face at this moment expressed shock because of the actions of the young master. Another excited maid asked the young master to follow her. Fan Xian, looking at what was happening, thought again. Yes, the capital was not like Danju at all. He realized that his politeness with the servants looked completely out of place here at the Fan residence. When that maid brought the young master to another corridor, she asked him to wait for the second mistress. Here he walked along the corridor, thinking that the second lady must not have come yet, so apparently the servants were not at all sure whether it was possible to let the guy inside. In that case, the young master could only wait. The young gentleman walked to the fragrant lit incense sticks and leaned on the column next to them, waiting for the second lady. Then he folded his hands in front of him and walked out into the courtyard with a disgruntled face. Everyone was burning incense sticks. Were they also hoping to get rid of the smell of an illegitimate child in their house? In that case, Fan Xian grinned, thinking of something. The maids looked out in terrible shock, examining the young master. Someone opened his mouth. Someone covered his face with his hands, wondering. They saw the young master sitting on a wooden chair waiting for the second lady. What did he really do it? The maids were surprised by the impudent behavior of the young master. Fan Xian was sitting on a wooden chair, happy as an elephant. He was quite comfortable. The maids at this time whispered that the younger generation had to stand humbly until the arrival of the elders. The girls wondered where the young gentleman had so much pathos. They were afraid of what would happen if the second lady saw this. A few moments later, a second lady named Lu Ruyu, who was the mistress of the mansion and the mother of Fan Ciji, appeared in the corridor. In addition, she was also in charge of all the internal affairs of the Fan mansion. Seeing their mistress, the maids straightened up and bowed to her. The woman came up behind the chair where Fan Xian was sitting with his eyes closed. Feeling the movement, he opened his eyes a little. She smiled sweetly, calling him Xianer, and said that he must have been very tired on the road and therefore sat down. While waiting for the lady, he looked at the woman contemptuously and then smiled broadly, greeting "Aunt to you." After a while, they went inside. Sitting down on the chairs, Lu Shuyu asked how Fan Xian's grandmother was doing, and Anzhou, the young gentleman, with a smile on his face, said that a few days ago a murderer came to their house, but fortunately the danger managed to escape. Then he said that everything else was fine with them in Danju. After that, he thanked Aunt Lu Ruyu for her concern. The second lady was smiling, gritting her teeth. She was Thinking that this kid named Fan Xian apparently deliberately clung to the word aunt and did not call her second wife like everyone else. In her opinion, Fan Xian clearly said that the difference between these words was great. However, it seemed to her that the young master was quite courteous. Then the second lady smiled tensely and said that Fan Xian should just come into the house next time, because what good would it be if people gossiped about the fact that Fan was being badly brought up in the mansion. Fan Xian also smiled tightly and agreed since Aunt said so. He thought to himself that Aunt Lu Ryu could not tolerate people, because Fan Xian of course reminded her that her husband had an affair on the side. Then the woman named Lu Ri smiled again and reported that Fan Xian's father worked in the household department. When she asked the guy that he apparently had come to take the exam or was planning to enter the service immediately, the young man holding a clay glass with tea in his hand smiled and said that he would do as his father ordered. Fan Xian then asked for his father was now and when he would return. Liu replied briefly that young master's father would be back soon. Then they fell silent, continuing to squeeze out smiles. The woman told the guy to drink tea. They each took a sip from the brown clay cups in unison. The lady in the yellow dress walked very quickly through the Fan residence. The servants shouted at her to slow down. The second lady named Lu Ryu and the young master named Fan Xian looked at the entrance to their room in surprise. Suddenly the wooden door swung open, and a young lady who was the most talented girl in the capital appeared in front of them. In addition, she was good at piano and chess and was also good at calligraphy and drawing. It was a grown-up young lady named Fan Zhuo Suo who was sent back to the capital by Fan Xian as a child. The girl was very happy to see her older brother's on. Zhuo Suo, wearing a beautiful yellow traditional robe, entered the room while Lu Rui was calmly sipping hearty. A young gentleman named Fan Xian looked at his younger sister as if spellbound. The young gentleman, seeing the girl, immediately got up from his chair. Fan Suojua walked up to him and bowed slightly, telling her older brother that she was very glad to meet him. Smiling warmly, Fan Xian stretched out his hands to his little sister and said that there was no need for such ceremonies. And the young man was already very happy to see his grown-up little sister named Fan Zhu. Someone suddenly burst into the room with his hands on his hips. It was little Fancy. He cast a smug glance at his older half-brother and asked the young man about whether he was Fan Xian. The young master giggled and asked Fan Zhuo about who this boy was. She turned around and looked at C, practically starting to say who this boy was. However, the young little master interrupted her and smugly informed her that he was the young master of the Fan family named Fan C. Then he pointed his finger at Xian and also arrogantly asked about the fact that apparently Fan Xian was the illegitimate child. A drop of cold sweat flowed down the guy's face. Fang Wo's jewel froze with an eerie expression on her face. Fan Xian then glanced at the chair where the second lady was sitting. It was empty. Apparently Ms. Liu left, deciding to use her son's youth and ignorance so that he would immediately make a fuss and try to embarrass the young man. Fan Xian stood straight while Fan Ziji hung around him and looked at him like an exhibit in a museum. The boy frowned up and said that Xian was very skinny, which means in the opinion of little C he was definitely an illegitimate child. Fan Xian, hearing these comments in his address, frowned at the bridge of his nose and clenched his so that he would not bring trouble to the Fan family with his boneless tongue in the future. It was necessary to immediately take up his upbringing. Fan Xian was about to say something caustic to Fancy, however Fan Suo's Zhou came to the rescue. Armed with a long wooden ruler, she sternly told Fancy to come to her and give her his hand. The kid turned around in horror and looked at his older sister. Fan Xian also turned around and was very surprised by what was happening. The beautiful Fang Wozu, all holding a long wooden ruler in her hand, sternly looked at Fancy. She shouted at the little gentleman again, asking him if he was deaf. Then she held out her other hand and told the boy to give her his, the latter trembling all over and drenched in cold sweat slowly approached the elder sister holding out his palms. Little Fan Xi even squeezed his eyes shut from fear. Fan Xian couldn't hide his surprise and remained silent looking at what was happening. With his eyes wide open, the frightened little Fan Xi put out his hands in front of Fan Yuo, and she, with an angry and stern expression on her face, hit her fingers hard with a long wooden ruler on her palms. He winced in pain. Beads of cold sweat stood out on the boy's face. Then, trembling all over and stammering a lot, he asked his sister why he did not have time to finish, as he again received a blow on the palms with a wooden ruler from Fan Zuo. The boy shuddered again and even screamed, while the frightened little Fan Xi, covered in droplets of cold sweat, trembled and blew on his palms, reddened from blows with a wooden ruler. And Duozuo lectured him. She sternly told the young second master that, firstly, Fan Xi could not call his older brother by name. Secondly, Fan Xi, according to the older sister named Fan Yuo, should have remembered the status of their family and not say such absurd nonsense. Fan Jules' gaze became even stricter and scarier. Little Fan Xi tensed up even more and began to break out in cold sweat. Because of fear, the girl continued that, thirdly, punishment for such disrespect to her brother was a natural thing. Then the blonde girl smiled sweetly and asked Fan Xian if she had spoken correctly. He exhaled and looked away, agreeing with his younger sister. Fan Xian was really scared himself, while Fan Yuo blamed the second young master. Having finished with the lectures and punishment, little Fan Xi, wiping away the flow of tears, screamed and called for his mother. The older children remained standing in place. Then the second young master ran, still crying and screaming, calling for his mother. The blonde Fan Yuo continuing to look after the retreating figure of the crying baby. Fan Xi sighed and said that he really always ran to his mother in tears. Fan Xian shifted his gaze to his younger sister and said that he was wondering for what reason this child was behaving like this. Fan Yuo, holding a long wooden ruler in her hands, folded her hands in front of her and, closing her eyes, calmly reported that it was because Fan Xi was a stupid pig, unable to think independently. Fan Xian looked at his sister strangely without saying a word. He was thinking to himself, so that's how it turned out. After some time, Fan Xian